On Sunday, December 8, 2024, 50 years of dictatorial rule ended with Bashar Assad fleeing the country of Syria. The Biden administration seemed alarmed about the events, but they should have seen this coming long ago, as did I, your humble correspondent. Intelligence analysts from many nations focused upon the problems in the Middle East, and they knew there was an undercurrent of discontent among the Syrian people, but it extended much farther than that. Why did rebels overthrow the Syrian government? Which groups or group were involved? Was there an external support network for the revolt? What will the new government look like? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Syria's civil war, which erupted in 2011 as an uprising against Assad's rule, dragged in big outside powers and created space for jihadist militants to plot attacks around the world and sent millions of refugees into neighboring states. Russia was the greatest presence, providing troops, weapons, and training facilities, being established with the assistance of Iran for growing a regional terrorist contingent. Assad's long rule relied upon allies to help subdue the rebels. Russian warplanes conducted bombings while Iran sent allied forces, including Hezbollah and Iraqi militia, to reinforce the Syrian military and storm insurgent strongholds where atrocities were reported. But since Russia has recently been focused on the war in Ukraine since 2022, and Hezbollah has been suffering heavy losses in the war with Israel, along with the Houthis and Hamas being hammered into dust, both Russia and Iran have been limited in their assistance to Assad. As a result, in record time, the rapid advance spanning less than 2 weeks saw the Islamist militant group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham sweep across Syria and capture the strategic city of Homs, and then they continued on to Damascus. Syrian state television broadcasted a video statement by the rebels stating, President Bashar al-Assad had been overthrown and all detainees in jails had been set free. So far, it does not readily appear that the despot Assad has been replaced by another totalitarian regime, but time will tell. The TV reporter presenting the report said the opposition group, Operations Room to Conquer Damascus, called on all opposition fighters and citizens to preserve state institutions of the Free Syrian State. This group was not alone, as it appears that there was an assortment of disaffected groups who joined in their mission to topple Assad, who had crushed all forms of dissent. It was reported that Assad managed to fly out of Damascus just ahead of the capital being overrun. The Syrian Army Command notified its officers late on Sunday the 8th that Assad's 24-year authoritarian rule had ended. At first, it was reported that Assad was escaping for an unknown destination, earlier reported that Sunday. This was stated to Reuters by 2 senior Army officers to a Reuters reporter. The message was sent after Assad had boarded a plane, whom we now know went to Moscow. This was confirmed by the head of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, Rami Abdel-Rahman, who told AFP that Assad left Syria via Damascus International Airport before the Army security forces left the facility. This means that Syrian military security personnel abandoned that facility as the rebel army approached, and there are reports that many such military locations were abandoned and the uniforms of the soldiers were thrown onto the ground. They just disappeared. The report also said that the rebels had entered the capital with no sign of army deployments. The current Prime Minister, Mohammed al-Jalali, said he was ready to cooperate with any leadership chosen by the Syrian people. This would mean that the Syrian army was also on board with the removal of Assad, whose history of dictatorial leadership and genocide have been no secret. Following Assad receiving the chemical gas weapons from Saddam Hussein in the 1990s, he stockpiled them. But all during Assad's reign, evidence had been collected. A Syrian military police photographer using the code name of Caesar had the responsibility of documenting the bodies of those who had been executed or tortured to death as proof that Assad's orders were being followed as he crushed an uprising in 2011. When Caesar defected in August 2013, he brought tens of thousands of photographs showing at least 6,786 bodies of people who had died in Syrian government custody. Most were victims of the 5 intelligence agencies who were working in Damascus. Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, also had a chemical weapons program, but it was relatively low-grade mustard and phosgene gas. Effective, but not very reliable. Bashar Assad, despite being a medical doctor by training, had a streak of Anthony Fauci or Josef Mengele in him. Because, in August of 2013, during another Syrian uprising, his forces fired rockets using sarin gas on Ghouta, a rural area east of Damascus that was controlled by rebels, and killed an estimated 1,466 people, mostly women and children. Assad, seeing the lack of global outrage over Saddam gassing his own people, mostly Kurds, and Vladimir Putin having no real repercussions when he gassed the citizens of Novichok with sarin, he probably felt confident, but people do have long memories. Assad was also on a spree of roundups, arrests, tortures, and executions from March 2011 through August of 2024. The numbers were an estimated 157,634 people being arrested, including 5,274 children, most of whom disappeared or were known to have been killed outright. The new regime, replacing Assad, claims that they will release all the records to prove and justify their actions very soon. There are promising changes to the cultural and religious laws that are currently imposed in all Muslim countries, according to the announcement by Ahmed al-Shara, the leader, meaning there will be less restrictions on women. After 50 years of oppression under Ba'ath rule and 13 years of crimes and tyranny and forced displacement, we announce today the end of this dark period and the start of a new era for Syria, the rebel faction said on Telegram. During the revolt, gunfire and explosions were clearly heard in Damascus, which was taken in only 24 hours and included video showing Syrian army hardware, including tanks, leading the assault, proving that there was a coup from within. Residents of the capital reported hearing gunfire and explosions. Footage broadcast on opposition-linked media showed a tank in one of the city's central squares, while a small group of people gathered in celebration. Calls of Allah Akbar, God is great, rang out from mosques. Losing Syria will cost Russia and Iran a lot of influence in the region, as Assad allowed terrorist and paramilitary forces to be stationed and trained there until they were deployed in the war on terror, as well as supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, as well as other Iranian proxies in the West Bank and the Houthis in Yemen. The rebel leader, Ahmed al-Shara, said that it was prohibited to go near public institutions that he said would remain under the supervision of the former prime minister until they were officially handed over. This seems to illustrate a paramilitary leader who wants a peaceful transition of power following their successful rebellion. Al-Shara also ordered the release of Assad's political prisoners. We celebrate with the Syrian people the news of freeing our prisoners and releasing their chains and announcing the end of the era of injustice in Sednaya prison, the rebels said, referring to the large military prison on the outskirts of Damascus where the Syrian government detained thousands of people. Of interest, Hezbollah, whose forces had been supporting Assad in Syria, vacated their positions around Damascus, according to a source close to the group. It would appear that they do not want to have anything to do with the new regime either, which may be a great sign of a positive change. Naturally, Israel reacted to the ongoing events as may be expected, as the IDF's 98th Division, paratroopers, and commandos took up new security positions in the Golan Heights, which has been an Israeli-controlled buffer zone between the two countries since Israel won the Heights in the last major Arab-Israeli war. The IDF has deployed troops in the buffer zone and in a number of areas that are necessary to defend, in order to ensure the security of the communities in the Golan Heights and the citizens of Israel, the military said in a statement. The move came following a fresh assessment and the possibility of gunmen entering the buffer zone, the IDF said. We emphasize that the IDF does not intervene in the events taking place in Syria, the military added. The question now is, will Assad be held accountable by the international community? It is possible, and here's how. National prosecutors in other countries could file charges under the concept of universal jurisdiction, which allows any authorized national court to address certain issues and also the most heinous of crimes. This includes murder, torture, as well as attacking civilians, use of weapons of mass destruction, and weaponizing healthcare. Several governments have already initiated such prosecutions, mainly for lower-level officials who happen to be in custody because they fled Syria. For example, a German court convicted a Syrian military intelligence officer for overseeing the torture center and sentenced him to life in prison. France has already charged Assad for the August 2013 sarin gas attack on eastern Ghouta, but had no ability to enforce that charge or arrest him using Interpol. As a sitting head of state, Assad has enjoyed immunity for such national prosecutions under a controversial International Court of Justice ruling. Having now been deposed, he no longer enjoys any such protection. The International Criminal Court, which recently and ridiculously charged Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu with war crimes, despite him being a head of state like Assad, for responding to an attack with only conventional weapons, assumed that prosecutor Karim Khan will file charges eventually. But the hypocrisy is quite glaring. Khan's greatest challenge regarding Assad has always been jurisdiction, since Syria never joined the World Court and a UN Security Council effort in 2014 to confer jurisdiction to Syria was, of course, vetoed by Russia and China, who both sit on the Security Council. No great surprise there. Those government officials who remained in Syria state that they will work with the new government. The fact that they did not leave with Assad may show that they were involved in the coup, or at least were a part of it. The Biden administration is reportedly monitoring the extraordinary events in Syria, which were in touch with regional partners, whereas President-elect Donald Trump has said the U.S. should not be involved in the conflict and should let it play out. Remember, it was Trump who bombed Syria, killing a lot of terrorists and Russians on the morning of April 7, 2017, when the United States launched 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles from the Mediterranean Sea into Syria, aimed at Shayrat Air Base controlled by the Syrian government as a direct response to the Khan Sheikhoun chemical attack launched by Assad. Currently, thousands of Syrians went to their border with Lebanon trying to leave the country. Lebanese border officials closed the main Masna border crossing late Saturday, leaving many of those people stranded. As usual, the UN chimed in and said it was moving non-critical staff outside the country as a precaution. So much for the capabilities of the UN, which have always been a failure unless led by US, UK, or French forces with competent leadership. The greatest ripple effect is what the effect has on the nations in the region, with the Muslim states possibly very concerned that if this new rebel regime does in fact relax, crushing restrictions upon women, and becomes more accessible to the West, their own people may see this action as a template for their own revolts. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Russia issued a joint statement saying the crisis was a dangerous development and calling for a political solution. They see their futures possibly changing, big time. I can guarantee you the Iranian government is very concerned about this fact. But what of the near future? Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the strongest rebel group, is the former al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, regarded by the U.S. and other nations as a terrorist organization, and many Syrians remain in fear that instead of bringing positive change, that it will impose even more draconian Islamist rule on the Iranian model. HTS leader Abu Muhammad al-Golani has tried to reassure minorities that he will not interfere with them and the international community that he opposes Islamist attacks abroad. On a positive note, there have not been any reports of reprisals in Aleppo, which the rebels captured a week ago. When Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was asked whether he believed Golani, he replied, "The proof of the pudding is in the eating." Assad's comfort zone in using chemical weapons and terror against his people arose after then U.S. President Barack Obama had declared that the use of chemical weapons would cross a red line, and Assad in September 2013 agreed to surrender his chemical weapons. However, because chlorine has legitimate uses, the government was not required to eliminate its chlorine stockpiles. Between 2014 and 2018, the Syrian military periodically used chlorine gas as a chemical weapon, even though such use violates the Chemical Weapons Convention which Syria had ratified. In April 2014 alone, there were 10 attacks in which chlorine gas was dropped on civilians in villages in northern Syria. An April 2018 chlorine attack on Douma in rural Damascus killed 43 people. Moreover, the government secretly kept a stash of sarin, which it used most lethally in an April 27 attack on Khan Sheikhoun in Idlib province, killing at least 90 people, which prompted Trump's response with the bombing. Assad also used starvation and deprivation to force opposition-held areas to surrender, such as eastern Ghouta and eastern Aleppo, where he imposed a total siege. Even when humanitarian agencies occasionally were allowed to deliver medical supplies and food, the Syrian military would confiscate much of what was most urgently needed by the people. This was a blatant violation of international law under both the Hague and Geneva Conventions, since even in time of war or even civil insurrection, it is expected that a belligerent allow humanitarian access to get to the people in need. Gradually, one by one, these areas caved in, with the people given the choice to take their chances under Assad's rule or to board the government's dreaded green buses for a one-way trip to Idlib in northwestern Syria on the Turkish border, the last area under rule of the armed opposition. Most chose to go to Idlib. But what it comes down to is international leadership. Obama's failure to enforce his red line policy only emboldened Assad and Iran, so the criminal actions only increased, but so did conventional bombings of civilians. With Obama's allowance for the creation of ISIS, it also brought that group into the fold. The Syrian Air Force notoriously dropped barrel bombs on residential neighborhoods in parts of the country controlled by the opposition. Barrel bombs were improvised weapons, oil drums filled with explosives and metal fragments that were dropped without guidance from helicopters, typically hitting the ground with huge explosions and the widespread diffusion of deadly shrapnel and petroleum products. Many of those in the active resistance to Assad had suffered under these attacks. These bombs destroyed neighborhoods and entire buildings and left broad strips of death and destruction, and Russia joined the conflict in September 2015 to prop up Assad's regime and give him aerial delivery capability. Bashar Assad's support of Russian and Syrian government airstrikes have killed more than 100,000 Syrians since 2011. These events were what fueled the rebel alliance that just recently took over the country. During Assad's rule with the bombings and persecutions, more than 14 million people, roughly two-thirds of Syria's pre-war population, were forced to flee, half going abroad and half remaining within Syria, creating the world's largest diaspora. Many who stayed in Syria went to Idlib, which borders Turkey, under harsh conditions, and they remained there. We can only guess how Syria's new rulers will act. Will they return to their jihadi methodology, or will they adhere to their more recent position? If they hold open investigations and allow external investigators into Syria regarding the past atrocities of the Assad family, then that would be a positive move in the right direction. So there may be hope after all. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.